Welcome back, everybody. We're going to have our final video lecture today, or maybe not the final, but for this series it will be the final. And I'm sure it will come to nobody's displeasure when I say this is the shortest of the videos that we'll be viewing among the series that you've seen so far. This one should take about 15 minutes, although I don't exactly know because I don't have the timer in front of me, but you'll be able to see by the time bar exactly how long it is and whether my prediction of 15 minutes from that I make at the outset of this video is accurate or not. But in any case, here's an extension to the ideas on global strategy that I presented to you in the previous video, where we talked about various structural alternatives to dealing with a flat or spiky world. In this one, I want to connote or convey to you a new idea or a comparatively new set of ideas on how we can conceptualize our approaches to managing the multinational firm, which is, of course, an essential part of global strategy. And this comes down to what we can call the 3 A's, which are adaptation, arbitrage, aggregation. Adaptation, arbitrage, aggregation. And these are 3 different approaches or 3 complementary approaches to the development of global strategy and the consequent structure of the multinational firm. You might ask, why? Why do we need the 3 A's? Why do we need the 3 A's? Already we have a reasonably comprehensive approach to global strategy and structure through the discussion of the international strategy approach, the multinational strategy approach, the global strategy approach, and what we also call the transnational solution. But those ideas on multinational strategy are premised upon 2 points, which are again the spiky or flat world concept. In other words, do we need to be locally responsive, or do we need to be globally integrated? And the idea is that adaptation is a locally responsive approach, whereas aggregation is the economies of scale approach. That can happen when we have a globalization of various elements of the multinational firm's activities. Is this everything? Is it all about aggregation, flatness, or adaptation, spikiness? And the idea is no. There's something else we can think about, which is arbitrage, which is about gaining absolute economies in the productive activities of the multinational firm. So we don't only think about why we globalize across markets, but we also think about globalization of production. Now, previously, in the transnational model ideas that I presented last time and that we discussed, that have actually been discussed for at least 2 to 3 decades now in the management of multinational firms, the idea of arbitrage and absolute economies in the globalization of production was kind of subsumed in the transnational or global strategy solution. But as a consequence of subsuming it, it became de-emphasized. And what this does, this idea of arbitrage, is it promotes to the appropriate level of emphasis the idea that we really need to be concerned about how decisions about the productive activities of multinational firms drive the decisions about how we structure the firm, and even before that, how we strategize about the positioning of the firm in its different markets, and for competition in those markets, where its advantages arise. So that's one of the importance. It heightens the idea that, yeah, production is important. We know it, but let's think about whether it's going to be, to what extent it's going to be emphasized in the firm's global strategy. So that's why we now have what we can call the 3A framework for global strategy, right? We have the idea of adaptation. Should we be focusing on adaptation in our global strategy? We do adaptation, as you might guess, if you listen closely to the previous, to the ideas we discussed on the multinational strategy solution for a spiky world. We do adaptation when the strategic objective is to raise revenues and market share by optimizing our products to the local market, right? So it's all about local market adaptation and consequently operating in the decentralized Federation, where we empower the CEOs and the top management team of the local subsidiary to the maximal degree. Then we might actually say, no, it's all about aggregation, right? All about aggregation. We need to build economies of scale. We need to integrate operations. We need to fundamentally think as a world, as our playground for how we structure and design the multinational firm. Whether we're regionalized, whether we're globalized, we're going to aggregate. We're going to build scale, and we're going to build a powerful competitive premise from this scale. To this, we add the third one, which is arbitrage. And this is where we emphasize building of advantages by exploiting market differences. And we locate our supply chains in different geographies. Now, this was always kind of subsumed in the other two solutions, but it was never really emphasized. And again, subsumed means it's de-emphasized, which is another way to say the same thing that I just said previously. The de-emphasized was perhaps okay in one day when we were thinking about the world across scale or as different product markets, flat or spiky. But we also have to think about the productive processes could be spiky as well. And to do this appropriately, we need to think about the arbitrage. We also need to think about it this way because the reality is that a lot of the globalization that occurred in multinational firms in the past 20 years was all about exploring arbitrage opportunities. Where can we optimally site production to not only lower costs, but also increase our ability to produce our products well. And so as a consequence, we had a huge dispersion of global value chains, both through offshoring and outsourcing, that led to this idea we need to better understand arbitrage. So as a consequence, we have this AAA framework of global strategic stances. Now, when we have those three stances, we also have certain emphases that emerge in the expenditure patterns of companies that reflect or create the kind of advantages that they want. Adaptation is all about what? Optimizing products to the local market. So as a consequence, we expect firms or companies that engage in adaptation as a primary strategy to spend a lot on marketing. So their advertising expenditures or other kinds of distribution expenditures compared to sales will be relatively high, especially as compared to firms that are not engaged in adaptation strategy. For companies who aggregate, they want scale. So R&D is going to go up. R&D expenses are going to increase, and as a consequence, sales, R&D as a percentage of sales will be relatively high. And this is where I said in the previous recorded lecture that we need more sales to drive down the value of this fraction. Now, actually, if you're really paying attention in the previous lecture, you would have heard that I wrongly called R&D as the denominator when it should have been the numerator in that fraction that defines whether the company needs to pursue or how the company can gain from increasing sales and thereby reducing R&D as a unit cost for each unit sold. In other words, that's the economies of scale argument. Then finally, we get down to arbitrage. And it's more about other costs and how we reduce those costs as a component in our cost structure for the multinational firm. Again, this relates to the idea that we're seeking optimalities in our production across multiple world markets to drive down various kinds of cost structures, such as most generally and accurately reflected by labor as a component of sales. How can we reduce labor as a component of sales for our productive activities through arbitraging cost differences in different markets internationally? That's what the arbitrage emphasizes. Okay? When we think about what happens with global strategy is companies progress through seeking one or more of these 3A advantages. So we think about most firms being situated either not really focusing on the 3As or on just one of the A's, right? Not really focusing on the 3As, but on one of the A's. So if we're not really focusing on any of them, we're not focusing on arbitrage, we're not focusing on aggregation, we're not focused on adaptation, then we're really just building awareness of these possibilities, about where we could gain from our international operations. And I'll pick up on this point further down the road, but this is where we start to be really strategic and maybe long-sighted about our internationalization process when we think about how internationalization can build one or two of these 3A advantages to lend us with a very powerful competitive premise that comes from being global. So this is just not seeing international activities as building up the revenues of the company. It sees international activities as creating a much stronger foundation for the competitiveness of the company. And that happens when we start to achieve one of these 3A advantages. So when we start to solidify one of those A advantages, be it adaptation, or aggregation, or arbitrage, then we start to create a more powerful competitive premise. If we can get to a second one, then we'd even be more effectively powerful. We could be more responsive, but also beating down our cost structures at the same time. So yes, being responsive, adapting means spending slightly more on advertising, but at the same time, if we're cutting our cost structures elsewhere, we facilitate that greater focus on the local responsiveness or on the marketing activities. Can we get to three of these? I'm not really sure. And if someone can find an example of a company pursuing all three AAAs, all three of the A's, that would be useful, but I can't think of one offhand. But then again, I haven't explored every company everywhere. So again, we have adaptation about being local, aggregation about economies of scale, and arbitrage about exploiting differences across markets, right? There has to be some prioritization though. Again, alluding back to that previous point, we have to think about where is it most optimal to develop the one or two, at least one or two of those 3A advantages. Where is the optimality in that process? And that's really where the idea comes from about the development of the company and thinking long term about some of these decisions we make to internationalize and how, again, they can feed into the overall strategic stance of the company. If we start to conceptualize it as, hey, we're going to be the tops at feeding into local market preferences, or we're going to establish a very powerful cost premise to the company through aggregating or arbitraging. These are decisions that should not emerge as an offshoot or unintendedly from the other international choices, internationalization choices. They should feed into the internationalization that are choices that are made to establish the firm as a global player. As with the global-local distinction, these 3A advantages are associated with different organizational types, right? So if a company is emphasizing adaptation, it also likely has a country-centric organization, host country-centric organization. In other words, a decentralized federation or a multinational structure. So again, these decisions are reflected in not only the strategy of the company and how it's going to compete in its different markets, but also the structure. Strategy and structure must always go together, just like developing and implementing strategy must always link together, and just like these must be driven by the strategic intent of the company. So if the strategic intent is to enhance adaptation for higher competitive acuity in each of its individual host country markets, then it needs a structure and implementation plan to support that. So we need that clear integration and linkage across the strategy processes of the firm to achieve that positioning, hopefully meet its strategic objectives or strategic intent. If we have aggregation, then likely we're going to have a cross-border grouping structure with global business units. If we have arbitrage, then maybe we're going to have more of a functional orientation. Maybe it's possible to combine these in a form of matrix organization. Why it becomes difficult to pursue all three of them? Because I'm not sure what kind of 3D or 4D matrix would be required to support both arbitrage, aggregation, and adaptation. So there are limits to the ability to manage these structures. Just as I alluded to in the transnational solution, which looks great as a potential way to resolve both adaptation and aggregation issues, but at the end of the day, it's extremely difficult to implement well, and it would definitely be almost impossible to implement if we added another dimension for optimization in the matrix structure, such as reflected by the arbitrage dimension. Okay? If we start to disentangle these more, we have this table that's reflected on the next 2 slides about what's our competitive advantage, what kind of questions we ask, and then how we achieve it through these different dimensions, right? So we can think about what's our competitive advantage. Should we be globalizing? If we are globalizing, what strategy do we implement across these different dimensions with respect to adaptation, aggregation, arbitrage? Then what's our configuration of our company? Do we operate in similar companies? Do we operate in different countries? Where should we locate our overseas operations? What kind of coordination do we have? How should we connect these operations? What kind of controls do we have? Who do we need to manage in the company in terms of who might or might not facilitate change, or who could be the change blockers? Are the key functions of the chief change blockers, for example, as in an arbitrage strategy? In an adaptation strategy, as I mentioned before, the country chiefs, the country CEOs in the multinational structure become overall powerful. If it's an aggregation strategy, then the account heads for different product lines become the most powerful individual. So we have all of these cascading situations that emerge based upon what's our choice of strategic stance, right? So previously, just a couple of minutes ago, I emphasized to you how your strategic intent feeds into your strategy, feeds into your structure, but this also feeds beyond the structural configuration into coordination, controls, change blockers, issues of corporate diplomacy, then even issues of corporate strategy along many, many different dimensions. So again, the idea is simple, but the implementation becomes extremely, extremely tricky. And again, by focusing on these 4 columns across these several rows of key decisions that represent the key decisions, we can see the complexity that emerges as we add more and more A's, or we go from 1A to 2A to 3A's in our strategic stance. Just achieving one of these within prominence is actually a tremendous achievement and could lead to a very strong foundation for a medium to long-term success in a company. If we can achieve 2, then we're in a very, very formidable position. So again, when we're thinking about this process, we want to think about where do we want to be, or where are we on the AAA triangle? Are we going to be, or do we want to be on the adaptation? Do we want to be on the aggregation? Do we want to be on the arbitrage? We have to think about this consciously and intendedly in the company, because as illustrated in the previous 2 slides, there's a lot of decisions that cascade out of that positioning. Then once we achieve that, we need to make investments along those directions, which are reflected in the expenditure patterns of the company as well. And then we think about which strategy or combination might also be the best. But again, it has to be a conscious decision that accompanies the other decisions or guides the other decisions that we make when internationalizing. In terms of company examples that can help to reinforce or solidify some of these ideas, if we think about an adaptation company, a lot of the FMCG companies or companies such as P&G or Unilever could be thought of these adaptation, right? They take products that are common to the company, but we emphasize them in certain particular ways across different markets. This is an idea that can be explored through the Unilever Lifebuoy example that we'll be talking about. And I think this really emphasizes some of these ideas, but in much more nuanced strategic objective space than would come from just cost or revenue optimization. IBM is a company you could think of as for aggregation and economies of scale. In fact, many of these big tech companies focusing on products are mostly about aggregation. You might ask yourself the question, what about Apple? What about Huawei? What about Xiaomi? Are they aggregation? Are they adaptation? Are they arbitrage? Are they a combination of any of these? Mobile phone space is really, really interesting because of the pressures to control costs at one end, but also the pressures to localize and differentiate at the other end. Arbitrage could be represented by TCS, Tata Consultancy Services. and thinking about where it gained its success, definitely provided good services, but at the same time was able to situate activities to drive down the costs of provision of those very same services that other companies provided, and hence they were able to equalize quality of services, but win on the idea that you just had to pay less for the same quality, for example, through that arbitrage. We can think about these different companies, and I challenge you to the idea about, do we see companies pursuing more than one A at a time, right? Can they pursue more than one A at a time? This requires innovation to be able to build up the strategies, and which combinations also make sense. Do you link adaptation with arbitrage? Do you link adaptation with aggregation? Do you link arbitrage with aggregation? And then if we're doing this, what challenges would come about? Going back to those previous slides on coordination, communication, and so forth, how do we begin to integrate these implementation elements to be able to achieve this combination of strategies? Extremely, extremely challenging. Would it be sensible to implement these? I really don't know, but definitely focus on one. There's a lot of sensibility in that, right? So what are the key points or the takeaways to conclude? Key points are number one, start to think about these. Start to conceptualize the internationalization process as building up the adaptation, aggregation, or arbitrage to achieve more acute downstream advantages or to achieve more pronounced upstream advantages in terms of either the development of technology, development of capabilities, or the cost of those same productive processes that yield your product. So we then focus on one or maybe two of the A's. Okay? Make sure the elements of the strategy are a good fit organizationally. Right? This is not thinking about what's our organizational structure and which one fits that strategy. It's thinking about what is our strategy for the development of arbitrage, for the development of aggregation, for the development of adaptation, and what do we need to do organizationally to make this a success. Right? Then think about the integration mechanisms, as illustrated again in that dense table of ideas, and then knowing when we have to integrate or not integrate across these different elements. All right. So the key points, the main two I want you to think about here, are number one and number two, which are thinking about which of the A's should be emphasized, and then thinking which are a good fit organizationally, or how to make the organization fit that one or two A that you've chosen to emphasize. Okay? So this is a slightly more nuanced presentation of ideas on global strategy. It heightens the idea, or it heightens the importance of the notion that when we internationalize, we have to have a far-sighted or long-sighted view of what we want to be the competitive position of the company. Internationalization is an expensive proposition with the company. It takes a long time to build up this organization. To recover those costs requires a very clear positioning internationally, and it requires a foundation of competitive strengths that are based on becoming better at adaptation, becoming better at aggregation, becoming better at arbitrage, that can support this company and its complications internationally, so that at the end of the day, you can be much more successful around whatever dimensions you're trying to optimize as a leader in that multinational company. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes today's virtual talk. Thank you.